While the Senate continues to work through this important process of the next Supreme Court nominee, I'm also here on the floor today to remind all of us that we're still in the middle of an unprecedented healthcare and economic crisis caused by this ongoing coronavirus pandemic. And I'm here to express my frustration that the sense of urgency and compromise that we had for the first several months of this coronavirus seems to have disappeared as we have approached the election. The Democratic leader today raised the seriousness of the pandemic. Some have said on the other side of the aisle we shouldn't even be taking up a Supreme Court nominee because of the seriousness of the pandemic and the need to focus on that. I don't understand why then on Wednesday the same Democratic leader and his colleagues blocked even taking action on the coronavirus or even having a debate on whether to take action, because once again they blocked a legislative initiative to have a discussion about this issue. And by the way, it's a discussion about an issue that affects every single one of our states. And again, we're not out of the woods. So we should be not just discussing it, but passing legislation on it. The legislation that we have introduced might not be legislation that every Democrat can support. In fact, I think there's some things that were in our bill that some Democrats might not love. But for the most part, it was bipartisan proposals that everybody can support. And all we asked for is that we be able to get on the bill to have a debate. And yet we had to have 60 votes to be able to do that. That's the supermajority that's required around here. And that 60 votes could not be found, even though last Wednesday, $500 billion coronavirus package got a majority of votes. There was a majority of votes, again, for this package, but not the supermajority needed. It was blocked by the other side. If we had gotten on the legislation and had the debate about what the PPP program ought to look like, how much money should be used for testing, what should we do with regard to liability protections, Democrats would have had the opportunity to put their own ideas forward, to offer their own amendments. And I would have strongly supported them in that process. Also, some of us had some additional amendments we would like to have added or changes we would like to have seen. But ultimately, if Democrats or Republicans found that they didn't like the final product that came out of that discussion, that debate, they would have had another chance, because there would have been another 60-vote hurdle to get over before passage of the legislation. And I know this is, sounding like a process issue, but it really is not. It's about us doing our jobs as senators. And both Republicans and Democrats care about this issue, and yet we just can't seem to figure out how to get it unfrozen here and to be able to move forward. And having blocked, again, even having a debate on moving forward was very discouraging to me. The economy is still struggling. As I said, we're not out of the woods yet, particularly in the areas of hospitality, travel, entertainment. We're not out of the woods on the virus yet either, with many states seeing a third wave right now. That's what I would describe as happening in Ohio, my home state. I've watched the numbers every single day this week. Not only are the number of cases increasing, but the hospitalizations went up this week. Number of people in ICU went up, and fatalities went up. It is critical that this Congress provide additional relief to be able to help the American people get through this healthcare crisis and economic fallout that we've seen. And we've done it before. 5 times, Republicans and Democrats on this floor and over in the House and working with the White House have passed coronavirus legislation. 5 times. In fact, most of the votes have been unanimous. Unbelievable, because here we are in this partisan atmosphere, but most of the votes have been unanimous. These laws have helped address both the healthcare crisis and the economic freefall that was caused by the virus and the government-imposed shutdowns. And for some of my colleagues who are concerned about the cost, I would just say, again, government-imposed shutdowns. Many of these businesses in my home state that are struggling, they were told to shut down. And they do need our help. They deserve our help. The same government that insisted that they not be in business ought to help them be able to get back in business and stay in business. The biggest of these bills that this body and the House and the White House have worked hard on and passed is called the CARES Act. A lot of people have heard about it. It's a piece of legislation that was very important at the time, but needs to be extended in essence now. It was passed by a vote in this chamber of 96-0. Unfortunately, since May of this year, when the last of these bipartisan bills was enacted, partisanship has prevailed over good policy, and Washington's been paralyzed, unable to repeat the coming together for the good of all of us. For months, Democrats insisted the only way forward was a bill called the $3.5 trillion HEROES Act, which passed the House of Representatives 4 months ago along partisan lines. It included things unrelated to COVID-19, and you can argue about those things. The SALT, the state and local tax deduction, is in there as an example. That has nothing to do with COVID. It's a tax break, frankly, for wealthier individuals. Most of that tax break would go to people who are wealthy. About half of it goes to people in the top 1%. There are immigration law changes in that legislation that are very controversial. Should we have that debate separately? Of course, but not in a COVID-19 bill. And there are other policies in terms of election law and how states would handle their elections that had nothing to do with COVID-19. Also, it was $3.5 trillion. Now, we are facing this year not just the largest deficit in the history of our country, but also a debt as a percent of the economy, which is how most economists look at our fiscal problems. What is the debt as a percent of the economy? It's as high as it's ever been, the possible exception of World War II, a year when we had huge military expenditures, but pretty quickly the economy grew and we didn't have this big overhang of the entitlement spending that already has us in a structural debt. So $3.5 trillion is a lot of money. When it passed the House, it was the most expensive legislation ever to pass the House of Representatives, by far. When it did pass, by the way, Politico and others in the media accurately called it a messaging bill that they thought had no chance of becoming law. There's a good reason for that, $3.5 trillion, and again, the items there that did not relate to the coronavirus crisis. Since that time, Senate Republicans have provided some reasonable alternatives to this partisan proposal with targeted coronavirus response legislation, bills that help us directly address the health care and the economic crises by investing in bipartisan approaches that we know work. Again, the last legislation that was offered here was on Wednesday. It was about $500 billion. That used to be a lot of money. And again, Democrats probably objected to some specific elements of it, like liability protection. But we should have had the opportunity to debate that, have a discussion. But on Wednesday, Democrats blocked it. Their position has been very clear, as I see it. They're going to stick with Speaker Pelosi no matter what. And I understand that from a negotiating position. They think she is the one negotiating with the White House, therefore, they're not going to get involved. I have talked to some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who have expressed the same frustration I'm expressing right now. Gosh, why can't we get together between Republicans and Democrats and support something that's a compromise? But I think they've been told by their leadership, no discussions, no debate. We're going to stick with whatever the Speaker wants. And again, coming up to the election, it's my sense that what the Speaker wants is not to have a result. That's my sense. You've heard the President say very clearly he's willing to spend even more than the Speaker wants to spend. I'm not suggesting that's a position that every Senate Republican has, because many believe we've spent a lot of money and we need to be very careful. It needs to be much more targeted, given the fiscal situation we talked about earlier. But Stephen Mnuchin, Secretary of the Treasury, has been very interested in getting a result and has in good faith been negotiating. But again, we've not been able to make any progress because the notion is we're going to stick with the Speaker's position no matter what. So instead of a compromise, we have zero relief. Instead of $3.5 trillion or $2.4 trillion, whatever the number is, and whatever the Republican number is, we have zero relief that's been provided in the last several months. There's been sort of a all or none attitude. Either we do it her way or we get nothing. 3 separate times on this floor, Democrats have even blocked proposals to temporarily extend the federal unemployment insurance supplement that expired in August, so that folks who are relying on that money could continue to make ends meet while we negotiated a long-term solution. This week, they blocked a reasonable approach on unemployment insurance, I believe, $300 per week, federal supplement on top of the state unemployment. And they blocked it saying that wasn't enough. We need to stick with $600. So again, it's either $600 or nothing. And I will say the $600 benefit is pretty generous. The Congressional Budget Office has told us that 80% of the people who are on unemployment insurance going forward, if we continued $600, 80% would be making more on unemployment insurance than they'd be making at work. Talk to your businesses back home, and what they will tell you is this has been a problem in getting people back to work when they can make more, sometimes significantly more, on unemployment insurance. But how about $300? How about a compromise? Some people will make more. In fact, a lot of people will make more on unemployment insurance than they do at work, at $300, but not 80% of the people. Some will make more, some will make less. Last week, I finally thought we had a breaking point because the Speaker of the House had members of her own caucus calling on her to work with the White House to pass, at that time, what was a $1.8 trillion package. But my understanding is that wasn't good enough. Let's get back to the common sense ideas we can all agree on. And by the way, many of these are in this targeted legislation that the majority of senators voted on this past week on Wednesday. Again, a majority, but not the supermajority needed to get it passed. First is on the healthcare response, particularly on testing. And in Ohio, we need it right now. We need more money for testing. Republicans and Democrats alike know that that's critical to stopping the spread of the disease and getting people more comfortable going back to work, going back to school, going back to their local businesses to buy things. We need the federal help on testing. We also need help to continue investing in developing treatments. And of course, we need to invest in the vaccine to get the vaccine as quickly as possible. The targeted bill that came to the House this past week did just that, provided $16 billion for increased testing and contact tracing, and an additional $31 billion for vaccine development. That's the kind of support we need right now. Second, we agree that Congress shouldn't continue to have this situation where small businesses are being forced to close their doors. So we all want to help small businesses. That was in the targeted bill also. One way we have agreed across the aisle is to have this PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program, be in effect. And the targeted legislation did just that. It restarted the Paycheck Protection Program, which was included in the CARES Act, but expired on August 8th. So since August 8th, we haven't had it. This was a smart program that provided low-interest loans to small businesses, loans that effectively became grants if you used it for certain purposes, like payroll to keep people employed, but also your rent or your mortgage or utilities. At least 140,000 Ohio businesses, in my state of Ohio, 140,000 businesses, small businesses, have benefited from the PPP, saving what we think is at least 1.9 million jobs. Wow. We all know we need to extend that program. I think everybody agrees on that. I don't know a senator in this chamber, Republican or Democrat, who hasn't had the experience back home of a small business saying, I couldn't have stayed open without this. I've had that conversation dozens of times. And a lot of these businesses were able to use this PPP loan to weather the storm. Some have seen their businesses now pick back up, and they're hiring again, and that's great. I recently had a virtual roundtable with manufacturers all over Northeast Ohio, the Cleveland area, Akron area. They were hit hard by the early shutdowns, It put their businesses at risk. But thanks to the PPP loans they received, they were able to keep their employees on payroll, keep the doors open. You know what most of them did? They did something related to helping. Some made ventilators. Some made masks. Some made gowns. So they were able during this slow time to actually help to push back against the coronavirus. Now they're back in business. Now they're able to employ people, to hire people, and to pay taxes and provide revenue to the government. That's what we want. There are others, however, who desperately need continued PPP just to stay in business. I mentioned the hospitality industry earlier, the entertainment business, the travel business. They've got to have the PPP loans now, or they may close. Some of them have already closed because the program's been shut down since August 8th because we can't seem to get our act together to provide the help. That was in the targeted bill. By the way, it makes PPP more targeted and more focused because we don't want to waste money. We want to focus it on companies that really need it. That's been bipartisan also. Let's do it. Beyond PPP, Congress should help invest in businesses to reopen safely and effectively. Small business owners I've spoken to during this pandemic, and especially in recent weeks, have told me they're eager to reopen, but they want to open in a safe manner. That's the sweet spot here. We don't want to close down the economy, but we do want the economy to be reopened and stay open safely. There are examples of how we can do that this Congress could pass on a bipartisan basis. One is an expanded tax credit to incentivize new hiring through the Work Opportunity Tax Credit and the Employee Retention Tax Credit. We also have a new tax credit called the Healthy Workplaces Tax Credit. Very simple. Helps businesses pay for protective equipment, like plexiglass, like hand sanitizer, like face coverings. These are credits against payroll tax that will help businesses rehire workers, reopen safely, take these critical steps to let our economy recover. I will continue to push this in every coronavirus package, and you know what? It has total bipartisan appeal because it's exactly what we ought to be doing. Reopening, yes, but doing it safely. Let's give businesses the incentives to do that. It's expensive to purchase the PPE, particularly when you got tight revenues, which a lot of businesses do right now. They want the help to be able to do it and do it right. Third, of course, we agree we've got to invest in our schools and our state and local governments with colleges and K-12 education trying to reopen around the country. It's critical that students don't lose any more progress in the classroom. We need to make sure schools have these resources to reopen, to stay open with adequate protective gear and social distancing policies. And again, plexiglass and other things to make it safe. The $105 billion that was in this legislation on Wednesday that was voted down, $105 billion for ensuring that schools are safe, is actually more than was in the original House-passed HEROES Act. So let's find a compromise here, but you can't say that helping the schools is a reason to vote no. State and local governments need support and more flexibility too. Ohio cities have been hit particularly hard because they rely on revenue from income taxes more than other cities around the country. And that income tax revenue has been lower than any of their projections. The targeted bill would have helped by extending the timeline in which CARES funding can be spent beyond the end of this year. I've heard this repeatedly from our governor in Ohio, Mike DeWine, also from local officials in Ohio. Don't make us spend all the money by year end. We can spend it more effectively if you give us some flexibility on that. None of us should want to do that. We always complain about the federal rule where you're telling an agency you've got to spend the money by year end, use it or lose it, because it encourages them to go ahead and spend it even though they don't need to so they can have the same budget the next year. Let's let them have the flexibility to spend the money as they need it. We all know now this virus isn't going away in calendar year 2020. It's going to be around in 2021. Let's give them that flexibility. With this extended timeline, we should also provide flexibility so they can be certain that they can spend the money where they need it, including for public safety, police, fire, EMS. Fourth, we all agree we've got to make sure Americans have adequate access to telehealth and telehealth medicine. Most of us in this chamber have probably utilized telehealth services during this pandemic, and we know that they work. Telehealth has been a lifeline for millions of Americans, particularly those fighting addiction, or those who have behavioral health issues, mental health issues, who can't currently receive in-person care to help in their recovery. I've worked with the Trump administration to expand telehealth and delivery options for opioid treatment, which in some instances has even allowed addiction specialists to reach new patients. I love hearing that in this dark cloud, one silver lining is that telehealth has actually been successful and helped people, including mental health providers and drug treatment providers, to reach new people who they couldn't reach previously. However, the reforms that we have in place now, based on the previous legislation I talked about, are only temporary. The bipartisan legislation we've introduced, along with my colleague, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, is to make these telehealth options permanent. It's called the TREATS Act. That should be in any coronavirus package, and it would be. Finally, we need to chart a path forward on the issue of expanded unemployment insurance. Unemployment's down from the highs we saw in the spring, and it's been very encouraging to see how many new jobs have come back. It exceeded all expectations, everybody's, OMB's, CBO's, outside projections. But unemployment is still way too high. We're still at 8.9% in Ohio. And it's probably about 8% nationally. And think of this, we went from the lowest unemployment we'd seen in decades just before this virus, more like 3.5%. Record lows for blacks, Hispanics, disabled, women, and now we've got about 8% unemployment, more than double that. I said earlier Congress allowed the original unemployment insurance supplement to expire without a replacement. When that happened, the Trump administration stepped in and used $44 billion from FEMA's Disaster Relief Fund, which had received funding from the CARES Act, to temporarily add a $300 per week federal supplement called the Lost Wage Assistance Program. This program funded 6 weeks of expanded unemployment insurance, also encouraged states to provide their own match. What happened was that every state but 2 took the government up on that. They didn't add their match, but they did take the $300, and a lot of people who had lost their jobs through no fault of their own were able to be helped through this executive action. Unfortunately, we're now at a point where this program's been tapped out. Why? Because the $44 billion that was set aside in the Disaster Relief Fund is gone, leaving $25 billion to deal with natural disasters, which is what the Disaster Relief Fund is intended to do. And they need that money. We shouldn't use any more of that. So we're back to square one. People who've had unemployment insurance since the disaster began, because they might work in hospitality, entertainment, travel, some business where they can't go back. A lot of those folks now are seeing just a state benefit or no benefit. The Republican proposal actually had a long-term solution by providing $300 per week through December 27th, so basically through the end of the year. That was in the package that was just voted down. So Democrats who say they want $600 voted down $300 because it wasn't enough. Well, to somebody who is on unemployment, you're probably wondering, why not just compromise and at least get me the $300 so that I can pay my rent, I can pay my car payment, I can make ends meet, even though I can't go back to my job. So if nothing else comes out of these coronavirus negotiations, let's at least provide more funding for the Disaster Relief Fund so that we can continue to respond at the executive branch level. If Congress can't get its act together, at least continue the $300 through the way the administration was doing it for 6 weeks. We've proposed legislation to do just that, replenishing the Disaster Relief Fund so that this vital unemployment supplement can continue that the administration had in place. If we can't pass a bigger package, why can't we just pass that? Why can't we just pass PPP? Why can't we just pass something for testing? Why can't we just pass something to ensure that we're helping right now during this crisis? The bottom line is that there's still a lot for Congress to do to help lead the country through this coronavirus crisis we find ourselves in. Between bolstering our health care response, promoting a stronger and more equitable economic recovery, getting the necessary funding to our schools, providing that flexibility I talked earlier to governments, ensuring that our constituents can make ends meet as they deal with sudden unemployment and other challenges, we've got a lot of opportunities to help our country weather the storm of this pandemic. I hope things will change soon. Maybe it'll change on the election. Maybe after the election there'll be a different attitude. I hope so. I hope that at least in the lame duck session of Congress, if we can't get our act together this week, that we can figure out how to recapture that spirit of bipartisanship we saw this spring, to negotiate in good faith, come to an agreement, and fast. Our constituents need it. Let's get it done. I yield back my time.